An introduction to Craig. Craig Schwabe has been my business partner for the past 25 years. We've worked together extensively in the geographic information area. Craig is a GIS specialist in the true sense of the word. And for the past 12 years, he's been focusing on government, the motor industry, retail network optimization. He is, in fact, an advisor to the South African government when it comes to network analysis and service provision. He co-authored a document titled The Guidelines to Improving Geographic Access to Government Services. He's the author of a number of books and scientific papers. He's also a presenter at many international conferences relating to GIS and geographic information. Craig is going to be joined briefly by Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson is from our strategic partner Frontline. Frontline has been involved in extensive mapping of the retail landscape in South Africa and in Africa. And Steve will talk briefly about the work that Frontline is doing and how that relates to network analysis. So I'm going to hand over to Craig to take us through the presentation today.
Thanks, Bob. Start off by really giving a perspective from my side in terms of how I see things happening in the retail market in South Africa. And I'm of the belief that we are not following scientific methods in the development of our retail networks. Now, one of the reasons why I say that is that if you look at information provided by Statistics South Africa, they show that in 2007, the takeaway and fast food markets, as an example, were generating a profit of about 7.8%. In the year 2015, that had significantly declined down to 1.5%, with a continued prediction that this will decline to around about 0.5% in 2018. And then, of course, we've had 2020, where we've had COVID and we have an economic recession. So the likelihood is that the profit margins in terms of the fast food and takeaway industries are going to decline even further. If one also looks at income statistics from Stats SA as an example, between the years 2015 and 2018 and 19, the income that is generated by the industry was 1.25%. So this is not profit. There is a slight increase in terms of the income, but this is generally as a consequence of the expansion of the retail network. So in 2020, we're going to see the industry, the retail sector, the fast food industry, the motor industry, all of the different sectors under pressure, especially because of COVID-19 and because of the economic recession. What one also sees, and many of you will have thought about this or seen this in the marketplace, is the continued building of new malls and people saying, well, can we continue to sustain all of these new malls? Companies within the retail sector indicating that they're going to expand their retail network by 200, maybe 300 outlets on an annual basis. And part of the problem is that we're now starting to see significant cannibalization of one mall against another one, with retail outlets also contributing towards this situation. What we also see in terms of the research that we have done is that in many instances, a lot of outlets have got negative growth. And this negative growth, in many instances, from the opening up of that particular outlet. Now, in terms of how this works, is that if you have got a retail outlet which is optimally located and another outlet is opened up in close proximity, whether it be a competitor one or of the same brand, what one sees is that that particular retail outlet will show a decline in its revenue for a period of about 6 months, and then will recover, as will the other retail outlet in close proximity. But if the retail outlet is located in a poor position, it doesn't recover. And that is why it's so important to be looking at retail optimization. So I'm of the belief that the use of site profiling and feasibility studies is part of the reason why this is occurring. We need to go back to the saying of location, location, location. And what that really means is ensuring that when you are opening up a retail outlet, that it is in the best position possible, that it is in an optimal position, and that one takes into consideration that it is within a network of retail outlets, not only of the same brand, but also in relation to competitive brands as well. So The idea behind this presentation is to give you a perspective in terms of some of the scientific approaches that can be utilized using geospatial methods, really to give some idea as to how we can continue to make our retail network sustainable in South Africa. So our presentation today is going to cover the following points. I'm going to touch off by just telling you a little bit of a difference between what profiling or site feasibility studies are all about versus retail network optimization. And then I'm going to talk to you about the frameworks within which retail development should occur. I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of considerations that you should be thinking about when developing your target market or your demand side, what one must also consider when looking at the supply side, and then the importance of what we call a trade area analysis. And finally, I'm going to give you a demonstration of some of the geospatial methods that can be utilized in order to look at retail network optimization. So over many years, we've been doing research in the retail sector, and over those years, I've started to develop this concept of the diamond of spatial network analysis. So this is what I would call a data framework. This is the framework within which one should be looking at retail network development. Now, this diamond concept has four main components to it. In the first instance, it talks about demand dynamics. It also looks at the supply side. And at the end of the day, supply and demand should be connecting to one another. And one does that across a network as an example. And that's what we call access or accessibility is a critical component. And very importantly is also consumer purchasing behavior. When we talk about demand dynamics, we need to clearly understand who is the target market for a particular retail chain or a particular retail sector. One then needs to develop this often unique information in order to define the target market of that particular entity. Now, the other aspect which is of great importance in looking at the demand side is defining the capacity and the travel time. Now, what do we mean by capacity? Capacity is the number of people that you require in your target market in order for that particular entity to be financially viable. And if you've got different types and sizes of retail outlets, then you need to develop capacity specifically for those particular outlets. The other critical aspect is the travel time, making sure that you are developing your retail outlets in an area such that there is sufficient travel time in order for customers to get to those particular retail outlets. On the supply side, we talk about where are your existing restaurants or where are your existing retail outlets, where are your competitor outlets, but very importantly is where are the preferred sites that if you are to expand your retail network, you would want to locate them in those particular positions. And I'll talk a little bit more about them in a couple of minutes. I've talked about access, but really what access is about is that it is about connecting supply and demand points across a transport network using different modes of transport. Now, on the consumer behavior side of things, this is quite an important aspect which hasn't historically been included into looking at retail network optimization because in many instances the information wasn't available. But you might define your target market as a particular population earning a certain income as an example, but you'll find that the consumer behavior in one area will differ to another area, and as a consequence, one has to look at what that consumer behavior is in relation to your own retail outlets and your network in those particular areas. So what we are trying to talk about is a much more holistic approach that I believe far surpasses the utilization of what we call site feasibility or gap analysis or profiling in the retail industry to identify not only the optimum number, but the optimum locations of retail outlets throughout the country. Now, just to talk a little bit about the difference between profiling and accessibility modeling or network optimization. And I want to say from the beginning that profiling or site feasibility studies have their benefits in terms of looking at the development of your network, but generally it should happen after a proper network optimization strategy has been implemented. Now, the situation that we see in the retail industry is that there is a difference between what we call proposed sites versus potential sites. What often happens is that a developer will approach a retail chain and say to them, look, we are developing this residential area or we are building this particular mall, and the retailer will then take up a position in that development in certain circumstances. That's what I would be calling a proposed site. The difference being is a potential site is the optimized location of where a retail outlet should be. And what we often find is that when one compares proposed sites versus potential sites, the proposed site is not in the optimum position. The retailer has now taken up that particular position, and as a consequence, the potential site, which is of a better position, is now taken up potentially by a competitor. Or the problem arises is that you've now destabilized the network of the retailer, and it continues to pull against each other because of it not being in the most optimum situation. Now, in terms of using profiling, there are two critical aspects that one has to think about in defining the area around a proposed site. Firstly is the concept of zoning. How do you define this area around the site that you are looking at? And there are many different ways that you can do it. You can utilize a buffer, you can use a travel time, you can utilize a catchment, you can look at the use of trade areas as an example. But you need to clearly understand which one is going to give you the best answers in terms of the profiling that you are doing. The other aspect is how big should this entity be? Now, is it a 5 kilometer? Is it a 7 kilometer? What is it that it should be? The bottom line is simply this, is that the size of the entity that you're defining must enable that retail outlet to be financially viable. And that is a very strong capacity aspect of looking at profiling, which is so important. Now, the other thing is, what socioeconomic factors should we be looking at in relation to this particular site, which will determine whether that particular site is going to be financially viable. And what we've seen is that the way that you present the data to whatever analysis or model that you're applying has a critical influence in terms of the success of what you're trying to achieve. So, for example, you can use raw numbers as an example, or you can utilize percentages, or you can utilize ratios. For example, in the one instance, you could look at total population versus population density. But another very important way to present your data is through the utilization of proximity. In other words, how close is this concentration of people to the proposed site that I'm looking at? And those particular indicators we have seen are probably the most important in determining whether that particular retail outlet is going to generate a particular turnover once it is developed. What one often sees as well in terms of the industry is that once this profiling has been done, one then utilizes an approach of comparing the proposed site with similar sites that are already developed in order to look at their turnover as an example. And my emphasis here is that you can't just simply do it in that sort of a comparative fashion. It has to be of a statistical nature in order to truly define whether the proposed site is going to generate the sorts of revenues that are anticipated. Now, if we look at what we call network optimization, it's a much more holistic approach. First of all, there is the defining of the target market and how many people in that target market you need in order for that entity to be financially viable. You've also got to then take into consideration the travel time. How far are people willing to travel in order to get access to that retail outlet? And in some instances, what is the elasticity of travel? In other words, how far are people willing to travel before they say, no, that is too far? Now, also one then has to look at what is the spatial unit of analysis in doing this. The development of the transport network, one has to then also consider where are my retail outlets? Where are my competitor outlets? Are there any particular barriers in the marketplace that I need to take into consideration that would influence my customers being able to get to this retail outlet? And then also very importantly, what are the exclusion zones? In other words, industrial areas, high crime areas, conservation areas as an example, that should be excluded and prevented from any sort of retail outlet being identified in those areas. So we need to also understand what are the preferred sites. Now, in the motor industry, one of the preferred sites that is often looked at is the motor hub. In other words, it is where there are 1, 2, or 3 or 4 motor dealers very close to each other. The industry likes to do that and pull their dealerships into those particular hubs because that's where there is an attraction point for the motor industry. In addition, major intersections are where there is the congregation of people. There's great visibility there, and as a consequence, putting your retail outlet close to major intersections is very, very important. And then also, of course, malls. You've got a lot of people moving towards malls, especially the super regional shopping centers as an example. So you're wanting to either locate your retail outlet within that particular mall, or you're wanting to locate it close by so you can have the benefit of the number of people that are passing by the mall. Now, in terms of retail network development, there are two critical concepts that one needs to be thinking about. The first one is what we call greenfields, and the second one is what we call brownfield. Greenfields analysis is you look at the market as if there are no existing retail outlets in that particular market, and then one utilizes the combined parameters of capacity and travel time to see how many outlets of different sizes and different types this particular market can bear. Now, the difference between greenfields and brownfields is that the brownfields takes into consideration the capacity, the travel time, but in addition to that, it takes into consideration the existing retail outlets of a particular brand, competitor brands, the preferred sites across a transport network. So it's significantly more holistic in terms of how it's looking at these things. Now, once you've done the greenfields analysis, it might tell you that the market can bear a certain number of outlets. You can then compare that to the number of outlets that you actually have in the marketplace. And if the greenfields analysis indicates that there is more potential than what you've got in the marketplace, one can then do what we call an expansion strategy. In the instance where you've got very similar numbers in terms of what the greenfields analysis says and what you have in the marketplace, then one would do what we call a relocation or optimization strategy. The last one would be in the situation where a company is in real financial trouble. It has to bring about a reduction of its retail outlets, and you find that the number of retail outlets in the marketplace is significantly higher than the greenfields analysis. One would then implement a reduction strategy. And within these strategies, there are a number of models that one can utilize to optimize market share or coverage of the market or minimizing travel times. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So this network optimization that I'm talking to you about is really about the implementation of what we call an accessibility study. The accessibility study really is about optimizing the number and locations of restaurants, fast food outlets, or retail outlets in a network by maximizing their market share within the smallest area possible across a transport network. So just to touch a little bit about theory, and many of you that are practitioners in the retail industry might think to yourself, well, what's theory got to do with the work that we do? Well, if one looks at it, one will see that over the many decades, the implementation of retail development has been utilizing many of the theoretical constructs that are in the retail industry in looking at how one does it. So the broad strategy that we talk about is called location theory. And that location theory is simply asking the questions about where is economic activity, where should my outlets be located, and why should they be located in those areas. Now, central place theory says that you have a central place where you open up your retail outlet, and that is serviced by central places in the network. And those central places, which is where your origins or your demand is coming from, has got a particular purchasing power, there are particular expenditure patterns, and there is a reasonable level of accessibility. Now, from the concept of central place theory was the concept of spatial rationality. And spatial rationality is simply this, that people will always travel to the closest retail outlet or service point from where they live or from where they're working. Now, in the public sector, spatial rationality works fairly well. It's not always the case. In the retail sector, it's less of the case, but that is one of the theories that have been developed and are used in terms of retail network development. So these concepts indicate that you do have what we call a retail network system. So what is that system? You might have a market where you've got a large mall that is being opened up in that particular market, but there is also a hierarchy of smaller malls of different types to occur in the same market as the large mall, as an example, and to remain sustainable. And I think that this is something that we've been struggling with in the South African situation. So from these theories, they bring up two critical aspects. The first one being, what is the threshold? And the threshold is the minimum target population required for different sized and different types of retail outlets in order for them to be financially viable. And then range, what are the distances that customers are willing to travel in order to get access to that particular type of retail outlet. Another theory that has come forward, and some of you might be aware of this theory, is spatial interaction theory and the work that was done by Huff, where he really says that one has to look at the probability of an individual shopping at a particular shopping center. And this is very much about the attractiveness of those particular sites. So people, when they go out and make a decision about going to a particular retail outlet, they look at the attractiveness of malls or retail outlets and make a decision as to which one they're going to go to. So the trade area, which was the concept that was put forward by Huff, you have a primary trade area and a secondary trade area. What's very important to emphasize is that the primary trade area is normally the area that you require in order for a retail outlet to be financially viable. But the secondary trade area, which is a marginal increase in the area, is the size of the area that you require in order for that retail outlet to be profitable. So this is quite an important aspect to be thinking about. Finally, just to talk a little bit about spatial competition theory, which is brought to us by Poteling. And that really says is that all retailers want to be located in the center of their market. But the problem being is other retailers also want to be in the center of the market, so they're clustered together. And when they're clustered together, then there is the sharing of those particular markets as an example. So this is why clustering as an example is a valuable approach, especially, for example, in the motor industry example, and to some extent in some of the other sectors as well. But where you have a retailer opening up very close to another retail outlet of the same brand, then this will bring about a negative aspect, and that could be considered to be cannibalization. So let's just talk a little bit about target markets. Important to emphasize that at the end of the day, there is no one data set that can be utilized for all retail sectors. One has to look specifically at that particular sector that you are in to make a decision as to what is the target market. So, for example, an important data set that one requires in looking at the fast food retail sector is fast food expenditure. And the value of that is that many of the fast food brands utilize fast food expenditure or as targets in terms of whether their retail outlets are doing well enough or not. What we have found is that generally speaking, income data is the most commonly used target market, but it needs to be current information. We can't continue to utilize the 2011 census as an example. One then also then has to define what is the threshold in that target market. And again, to emphasize that this is not one fits all. You have to define it in terms of different size and different types of retail outlets in your network. Now, we have the target population, but we also have subpopulations within that target population. And this is, for example, what we call the working population. This is the daytime population. The census measures the residential population, which is a nighttime population. But these two subpopulations are mutually exclusive, and you need to be able to quantify both of them in making decisions about where you would locate a retail outlet. And there are many other subpopulations that one has to consider. The entertainment submarket, as an example, the tourism submarket, especially on coastal areas, and also what we call visiting commuters, for example. This is when a person travels from one area to another area for business purposes and doesn't stay at the destination and travels back. They are very important in terms of looking at the drive-through market for the fast food industry, as an example. And the sources of this information are generally the household surveys that are conducted by national statistics agencies. And one is then able to utilize what we call small area estimation or machine learning methods in order to disaggregate information from the household survey down to small spatial units of analysis. Finally, just another important thing to consider in defining your target market is your market share and growth potential. Your market share can be defined in different ways. One of the ways is through the utilization of what we call an effective share. Another way is having an understanding of the turnover of a particular retail outlet and a particular brand. One can then look at that for the entire industry and start to look at what percentage market share you have in an area. One can also utilize what we call a competitive analysis by the mapping of the different retail outlets. One fairly quickly gets an understanding as to what the market share of one particular brand is versus another. And very importantly is this consumer data. Some of you might know that the AM survey is now being replaced by the Media All Products survey, which is being implemented by the Market Research Foundation. And for the first time, South Africa is going to be able to get access to detailed consumer behavior data at the lowest spatial unit of analysis, which is critically important for the development of the industry. Just to touch a little bit on the supply side, the mapping of the retail outlets and competitors, where are the preferred sites, defining the retail outlets in terms of size and type and revenue targets is very important. And this data can be obtained from the companies themselves by doing web scraping as an example, or there are many companies that make this data set available across South Africa. But it's an invaluable thing to be able to have a look at where is your outlets relative to those of your competitors. Just visualizing it, one starts to get a feeling for what market share you've got in a particular area and where are the potential gaps. But emphasizing again that in taking up a gap, one should be utilizing proper network optimization. I'm just going to ask Steve to just tell you a little bit about the retail census stuff that they have been doing in South Africa and the rest of Africa.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So that was very insightful, and I think this dovetails nicely. So we won't go into too much detail, but there's a lot of detail to go through. So in 2019, Frontline completed a large sample census of South Africa, which covered about 40% of the geographical mass of the country. And basically, where you see this red is where we walked and collected 150,000 points of interest, in this case, fast-moving consumer good outlets. And inside that there, when we talk about target markets and targeting and looking at the ecosystem around certain sites, then the retail census is going to give you a lot of that insight. And this data is down to point data down to the front door of these stores across multiple channels, from top-end modern trade all the way to tabletop, bottom end of the trade in the traditional market, as they call it. So top of the pyramid to the bottom of the pyramid, if you look at it that way. And these insights can be aggregated or point data to help you to make these decisions. And whether it's brown or green fields analysis that's needed, base data is definitely needed to give you the understanding of the landscape of a country. And it's very important to have quality data that is able to give you those insights and direction in which way you need to take, whether you're doing those brown and green fields analysis. So the ecosystem around that is exceptionally important. And because of the base layer data and the layers of maps that AfricaScope can access, when you put down the information of the census, you can take it down to the most smallest enumerated area and start understanding how that area behaves. So if you look at the townships, for example, South Africa, there's over 500 that Craig and team have denoted. And basically we covered 318 of those, where we found 75,000 bottom end or retail type stores, mostly in the bottom end of the market in terms of traditional type stores across South Africa. Obviously, there are more than 150,000 retail stores in the country, but at least now we have this data and we want to update it yearly based on various ways of rolling out a census across the country. This can also be done across the whole of Africa, which we have the absolute census data as well in most of the Southern African and East African countries. So, yeah, I think that Bob and Craig would agree that having this kind of data that is up to date could help them entirely with their network optimization processes as well. So I think that dovetails nicely. Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, just to add to what Steve is saying is that associated with each of the points in the retail census is an extensive amount of attributes that can be utilized to get a deeper understanding of consumer behavior in our country. I mean, one of the questions that we've been able to answer more recently, because it was a question that is coming up in the Gauteng government, is what percentage of the retail outlets that we have in the townships of Gauteng, as an example, are owned by foreigners. And within a very short time, we were able to go back and say to them it's about 62% are owned or run by foreigners in the townships of Gauteng. So that's the power of this information that Steve and them have been collecting. So just to move on to the trade area analysis, a trade area is the unique geographic area from which most people are traveling in order to get access to an outlet. We've talked a little bit about the primary and secondary trade areas, so one can distinguish between those two. What's very important to emphasize is that the trade area, whether it be of the same brand or of different brands, may overlap with one another. It is also very importantly the only means to accurately define the average travel time that customers are traveling in order to get to a particular outlet. And once one has that information, one is then able to apply that in looking at the identification of new sites as the retail networks are being expanded. It also tells you about elasticity. If you are to utilize what we call gravitational modeling as an example, there is no effective mechanism of defining what the gravitational pull is of a network, or up until now hasn't, but the utilization of a trade area allows you to determine what the gravitational pull is, or the elasticity of travel for a particular customer is in relation to your retail outlet as an example. And what's very important in this as well is that you need to define the travel times distinctly for the different types and sizes of retail outlets that you have, and also, for example, distinguishing between the location of retail networks within metropolitan areas versus towns in the more rural parts of South Africa. I'm the belief that the use of the trade area is the only true way to create that zonation associated with a proposed site. It gives you the best indication of what the true market potential is of a particular site. And one can then utilize that trade area as a mechanism by which to look at statistics and define targets that can be set, whether it be a motor dealership or a fast food outlet or even an insurance office as an example. I just want to touch base on the geospatial methods. One of the most important things that one has to do in looking at retail network optimization is to create your distance matrix, which is the connecting point between your supply and your demand, or your origin and destination points across an appropriate transport network. One also has to define your spatial units of analysis, which provide you with all the information on your target market. What's also very important is that you cannot generally do a retail network optimization exercise for the entire country. So as a consequence, one generally focuses on provinces at a time. And if you are going to do the study in Gauteng, then you need to create a buffer area outside of Gauteng, because people don't abide by administrative boundaries in terms of their travel patterns. So a person might live outside of Gauteng, but travel through on a fairly regular basis in order to get access to retail outlets within Gauteng, and vice versa. So the road network is important. What also is important is to understand that the road network itself is not the transport network. It can be utilized as a transport network for motor vehicle modes of transport. But in South Africa, a majority of our people utilize public forms of transport, which might be a taxi, a bus, or a train as an example. And we need to be taking those networks into consideration, because those people don't have the luxury of being able to get access to any road in our country. And that has an influence as to the accessibility of particular areas. In other parts of the world where you've got other modes of transport, for example, walking or bicycle, one should integrate all of these different forms of transport modes into one to be able to realistically and holistically look at the accessibility of any particular area. And that is something that we haven't even got close to in South Africa. We're starting to look at that sort of sophistication in some of the European countries. So this is an example of spatial units of analysis. It could be the enumeration areas from the 2011 census. You could develop what we call strategic areas. A strategic area is epicentered around major intersections. So we know that a particular retail outlet or brand might be wanting to locate always close to the major intersections. So one creates your spatial units around those intersections. Or you could utilize, as on the right-hand side, what we call tessellations, which are hexagonal, to look at finding the distribution of your target market. So what you then do is you integrate your information into your spatial units of analysis, you overlay your transport networks, you create your distance matrix, and then you are able to get information at the smallest spatial unit of analysis in terms of aspects like fast food expenditure or a particular income group as an example. And that is your capacity that you need to be looking at in defining where you can locate new retail outlets. So what I'd like to do now is just to give you a demonstration of the sort of capabilities that are available in terms of the conducting of retail networks. So first of all, there are different sorts of models that one can do. One can do gravity modeling, or it can do service location modeling. And if one is going to do service location modeling, then there are different approaches that can be utilized.
One can do an expansion or a relocation or reduction strategy, and a combination of the two. An expansion strategy is where one finds that one has got too few retail networks and want to increase. Relocation is when the network is not as optimal located as it should be. And then finally, also there is the reduction strategy. Reduction strategy allows one to reduce the number of networks if a company is in trouble or it has too many retail outlets, as an example. And we have done a reduction strategy for one of the motor companies in South Africa historically, and they have now got to a position where they have got an optimum number of dealerships, and now they're able to start looking at the expanding of their network, the expanding of their products that are available to the marketplace, and they are in a far better position. Now, what's also important to know is that when one looks at a transport network, one can either have a unidirectional or bi-directional transport network, and one has to take that into consideration. One can then look at a whole range of other models which can be utilized as part of an expansion strategy, as an example, such as, for example, maximizing the individual market share, as an example. And there are different models that one would utilize in the public sector versus the private sector, as an example. So in this instance, we're going to maximize individual market share. One of the factors that one has to take into consideration is whether there is a partial solution. In other words, are there particular areas where you would like the model to look at in order to locate retail outlets? These are what we call the preferred sites. Once one has made that particular decision, one can then start to look at what is the target population that should be utilized and what variables specifically should be utilized. So in this particular instance, we're using individual household income of a particular income group. Once having selected that, one can then decide as to how you want to develop the network. Do you want to create a coverage of an entire area, or do you want to just identify the top 5 sites as an example? So in this instance, we're going to look at the next 5 sites in the Gauteng area. One can also identify no-go areas or areas of exclusion, such as industrial sites, conservation areas, vacant land, as an example, and exclude those areas from the model. And then one can also put in a distance parameter. So in this particular instance, we're putting in 600 seconds, which is a 10-minute travel time. And what we have found is that between 10 and 14 minutes is often the sort of travel time that is used in order to get access to retail outlets in the major metropolitan areas in our country. And the travel time that you utilize for a metropolitan area is very different to that of a town, very different to that of a rural area, as an example. So we've now run the model. The model is going along, and the first round finds that it can access 8% of the target market. In order for that to be accomplished, uses 386 out of a total of 4,222 spatial units, and then it plots the location of that particular location. And as you can see, the site is being located, as well as the area of demand that it requires in order for it to be financially viable. This particular site is in the northern parts of Johannesburg, as an example, and it's been identified. What's also been identified is the hashed areas, which indicate areas where you have got no demand, and as a consequence, they've been excluded from the network. The model continues, and what one then finds is that the second best site can reach a 7.3% of the target market. And when one runs these sort of models, the first one is the most optimum position. It then consistently finds the second and third best. And in this particular instance, you find that it has to access more spatial units in order for it to meet the criteria in terms of capacity and travel time. And what's interesting is that the first site is identified in Johannesburg and the second site is identified in Pretoria. And this is often the situation when one does retail network optimization in Gauteng. But of course, Johannesburg and the greater Ekurhuleni area have got a much larger population. As a consequence, they've also got a much larger target population. So one finds a particular area tends to have far more sites identified than in the Pretoria situation. So the model is running. It's now going to identify the third best site. The site can access 7.1% of the target market. It has to do that with amalgamation of significantly more spatial units, which it does. Again, it remains within the parameters that have been set in terms of travel time and capacity. you find that the site that is going to be identified now is situated further south of the third highest or third best site in Gauteng. So one will very quickly see where it is positioned, and then the model will go ahead and identify the final site in the province. So the fourth best site accesses 6% of the target market, got significantly more spatial units than the previous round. So there's the fourth best site in Gauteng in terms of this particular example, and it's the southern parts of Johannesburg, and it now goes ahead and looks for the final site, which is number 5. This site is able to access close to 6% of the target market. And the critical thing to understand is that there are a range of different methods which one can utilize in order to identify optimally what the capacity for a retail network should be and what the average travel time for a retail network should be, and one can adjust the models appropriately and fairly quickly in order to maximize access to the market, as an example, or maximize the provision of government services, as an example. So site number 5 is also located in the Johannesburg area, and there you can see the 5 sites that have been identified, and they are then placed in rank order. What then happens is that the information from the model can be saved. We then need to calculate the catchment areas around these points and to deduct the available demand that was already being served by these 5 points. And once you've done that, that gives you what we call the remaining demand available in the marketplace, and one can then look at what parameters one utilizes in terms of capacity and travel time to see how many additional retail outlets outside of the area that has already been allocated to these 5 sites can be identified for the retail network. So we are going ahead here in terms of the catchment area analysis. We've defined the target market and the variable to be utilized. We've defined what the capacity is of those units that have been identified, and we've also identified what the travel time should be, and then we can go ahead, and there's a whole range of different variables that can be calculated from the catchment area analysis, but probably the most important is the remaining demand. This is the figures that will be used in the next round to try and identify additional outlets outside of the areas already identified. So we run the catchment area analysis, and then we go ahead and run the model again, and we utilize, in this particular instance, I've just used exactly the same parameters and the same sort of models just to give you an idea of what it will do. And one then also makes decisions regarding whether one utilizes preferred sites, what is the target market that's going to be used. In this instance, it's the remaining demand of the target market and how many sites we'd like to find. So in this instance, again, we have identified 5 sites that we're wanting to find. We defined whether there are no-go areas now and also what the travel time is. So we can adjust these figures in order to continue to look for gaps in the marketplace. But again, this is a holistic approach in identifying the facilities. We then run the model. We save the results to a particular variable in the database, and off it goes. And the first site that is identified is in the southern part of Gauteng, outside of the areas where the demand has been taken up by the first 5 sites, as an example. So the model continues to run, and this is the final result. There are 5 sites that have been identified, 1 site in the south of Johannesburg, then 2 and 3, 1 in the Bronkhorstspruit area, and then 2 sites to the south and the west of Johannesburg. And what's interestingly is that the site in the west of Johannesburg is made up of little parts. The model is actually saying that I can find sufficient demand within a travel time from these little parts which were not taken up by the original model. And this is the end result. This shows you the network covering the whole of Gauteng, the spatial units of analysis, and the outputs from round 1 and 2. And one can see that the central parts of Johannesburg is where the highest demand is available by the size of the green dots, and then the sites that have been identified utilizing fairly similar parameters on the outskirts of that particular area. So that's the running of the model.
So what is the benefit of using network optimization and these geospatial methods? If one has a look at the map, which I'm representing the model that I've just run against the original retail outlets in Gauteng, you'll see that there in many instances where the red sites are, the proposed site or the potential sites are not close to them. And as a consequence, it's identifying gaps in the retail network for this particular example. In some instances, you find that the proposed sites are very close to where an existing site is. And in essence, what it is doing is it's confirming that that particular site is in an optimum position and should be maintained in future modeling of the retail network. The other aspect about this is that it's showing you that if you're looking at the potential sites, there are many of the existing retail outlets that could be relocated to optimally locate themselves and maximizing their access to the market share in the target market. So what I wanted to show you today is the scientific approaches that can be utilized in combination with geospatial analysis to give you an idea of how we create sustainable retail networks in South Africa. I am of the opinion that the utilization of site feasibility and profiling methods in the retail industry is hurting the industry, especially if one looks at it in relation to the reduced profit margins over many, many years, the negative growth of many of the outlets out there. And we're going to have the double whammy of having the impact of COVID-19 as well as the economic recession hitting the retail industry. So we need to be doing this much more wisely in future years to sustain the retail network in South Africa. So we really do need to follow a much more holistic approach, considering many more factors, and I'm sure that there are other factors that could be taken into consideration, but looking at these factors in unison to ensure that we have got sustainable retail networks in South Africa. Thank you.